Should New York Giants general manager Joe Schoen be on the hot seat? A look at his successes and shortcomings coming your way next on the Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Today's episode of the Locked On Giants podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, credential member of the New York Giants media for Locked On, as well as for New York Giants on SI, which is where you can find all my written work, and there's been a lot of things to write about, let me tell you, so do check that out. And as always, welcome on into my Blue Crew community members, to my everydayers, to my newcomers, and everybody in between. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with us here on the Locked On Giants podcast. And please, if you haven't already done so, consider subscribing to the YouTube channel. It all helps. Like the video, click the little bell to be notified when I post new videos. And if you listen over on our audio platforms, consider subscribing as well, and a 5-star review if you would mind. So, all right, on today's Locked On Giants podcast, I'm going to talk about general manager Joe Schoen. Now, I spoke yesterday about Brian Daboll and just the whole coaching situation. I want to turn the attention now to Joe Schoen, because there's a common belief that Schoen and Daboll are married in terms of if one goes, the other one has to go. And I want to take an objective look at Joe Schoen, his successes and his failures as general manager. Now, I know many of you are going to say, but Pat, look at the record that he's had, especially the last couple of years. How can you talk about any kind of successes? Well, I'm going to get into all that with you. I'm going to break it down according to draft. I'm going to break it down according to free agency trades. We'll talk about cap management, and then I'll give you kind of my assessment as to what I think is going to happen there. So that's our program for today. Again, welcome on in. Let's start with the draft. Okay, the Giants have made 25 picks in Joe Schoen's 3 years and 3 drafts as general manager. Now, ideally, they tell you, they being the quote-unquote experts, say, give a draft class 3 seasons before you fully judge it. So right now, you can make the argument that the jury is still out on Joe Schoen's draft classes. I'm going to say right now, while I agree with that, I'm also going to say this. Number one, you look at their first-round picks, okay? You should have impact players amongst your first-round picks. The Giants have had 4 first-round picks under Schoen. Kayvon Thibodeau, Evan Neal, Deonte Banks, Malik Neighbors. Is there an impact player amongst those 4? You can make a case maybe for Malik Neighbors, but, lately he hasn't been, quite the hot player that we saw earlier in the year. Although how much of that is a result of how he's being schemed to get open and that sort of thing, that's, a topic for another time. Thibodeau had a great year last year, but he was injured this year, so that's going to put a dent in his production. Neal, Banks, those are 2 guys they basically had to reset, if you will. Neal with, having to learn the new offensive line coach Carmen Bracillo's preferred way of doing things. So he's basically starting from scratch. And then you had Deonte Banks, who initially was drafted because he was a press man cornerback, which fit what Wink Martindale did, but doesn't necessarily fit what Shane Bowen has done. So really, that you can make a case that the first round picks of the Giants, other than maybe for Malik Neighbors, haven't quite made the impact you would like to see a first round pick make. Now, here's the thing with Joe Schoen's draft class that, in my opinion, is the most glaring issue out of everything. Joe Schoen, in my opinion, has whiffed on players in the trenches. All right, look at the offensive linemen. Can you honestly say of all the offensive linemen that he's drafted that there's an impact player amongst them? All right. I mentioned Evan Neal. You've got John Michael Schmitz. You've got Joshua Azudu. I'm just trying to think if there's any others that are still on the roster. There were no offensive linemen drafted this year. I mentioned Schmitz. I mentioned Neal. Marcus McKeffen's no longer on the team. So, offensive linemen, there any impact players there? No. Defensive linemen, again, no defensive linemen were drafted this year. They had in previous years Jordan Riley, who can't get on the field. Let's see, they had, I think was he the only one? I believe he was the only one. There was DJ Davidson, who's getting playtime on the field, but is he really making an impact? I don't think he is. So, look, it's come to, as far as the offensive line, they hired Chris Snee, former offensive lineman, to basically scout offensive linemen. All right. That tells you everything you need to know about how badly the Giants have drafted at one of the most important areas on the team, and that is in the trenches. So I would say, if you're looking in terms of Joe Schoen's draft classes, while the jury is still out on, this year's class, which, by the way, looks very promising, probably the most promising of the three, and last year's class, the jury is still out there. And then the first year's class, you could say that was kind of a throwaway type of class. Schoen has had mixed results with his drafts based on what we know to be true today. Now, again, come next year, maybe some of these guys will really come into their own. But right now, if you can tell me, other than maybe for Malik Neighbors, that they have a surefire, can't miss, all pro on their hands. All right, maybe you can make a case for Drew Phillips. I don't know. It's still early. Tyrone Tracy's still early. But otherwise, they really don't have anybody you can honestly say, wow, that guy is going to be, the next Dexter Lawrence or the next Andrew Thomas. So, the draft, that's the core. If that's what you use to build up your foundation, Shane's drafts have been, meh. So, all right, coming up next, we're going to continue our look at General Manager Joe Schoen, and we're going to take a look at free agency and pro personnel and what he has done in those areas. So please don't go anywhere. Struggling to find the perfect gift during the holidays? Skylight Frames is the touch-screen digital photo frame your whole family will love. Upload thousands of photos with your phone and watch them appear in seconds. You can even invite friends and family to share photos with the free Skylight mobile app or via email with no account or subscription required. Photos are displayed in high definition resolution on your choice of 5 different frame styles and 2 different frame sizes. The original 10-inch or larger 15-inch gallery frame. We're confident that you'll love Skylight, but if you don't, they offer free returns within 120 days of purchase. And now for a limited time, you can get $20 off your purchase of a Skylight frame when you go to skylightframes.com/NFL. That's SKYLIGHTFRAME.com/NFL. Skylightframe.com/NFL. Hey, Giant fans, get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the very same page where you place your bets. Visit FanDuel.com to get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right, Giant fans, we are talking about General Manager Joe Schoen and just kind of doing an overview of what he has done in his 3 seasons as the general manager. We looked at Brian Dable yesterday. We're looking at Joe Schoen today. Is Joe Schoen on the hot seat? Should he be on the hot seat? Let's talk about his free agency and pro personnel moves. And by that, I also mean, trades, lack of trades, free agency acquisitions, and that sort of thing. All right. Free agency, I think for the most part, you got to say it's mixed bag. And I say that because, you know, over the years or since Joe Schoen has come on board, there has been some young talent that they have tried to retain and haven't been able to. Julian Love comes to mind, for example. You can make a case for Saquon Barkley, who they tried to re-sign and weren't able to do. Xavier McKinney, who's having a great year over in Green Bay. I don't think there was ever any interest in re-signing him. But I'll say this as far as, free agency goes with the Giants. Joe Schoen has put positional value on certain spots, running back and safety being one of them. And in reshaping the salary cap, which we will get to in the next segment, he has kind of made sacrifices, if you will, as far as where he's spending and allocating the money. Now, in a way, that's not a bad thing. And let me explain why. Because when you build a football team, ideally you want to build it from the inside out. So you want to start in the trenches and build outward. The exception to that rule is quarterback, which we will get to in the next segment. All right. So you look at what Shane did this year. Where did he pour a lot of resources? On the offensive line, particularly along the interior, which was a weak spot last year. Right now, unfortunately, it meant that he couldn't compete to keep Saquon Barkley. But quite honestly, I'm not so sure Saquon Barkley wanted to come back here after the year before, and how things went with his contract negotiation. And also, quite honestly, even though Saquon is tearing it up in Philadelphia, and good for him, he's got a great offensive line out there, a good scheme. I doubt, or I should say, I would question whether he would have been able to do all that he's doing out in Philadelphia here. But, Saquon just, he was a luxury this team could not afford. And quite frankly, he was a luxury this team should have never taken when he was there in the draft. They should have gone offensive line. And again, I know why they took Saquon. They were trying to help extend Eli Manning's career. In retrospect, that wasn't really the way to go. So that being said, you look at some of the other moves Shane has been able to accomplish. For example, trading Jordan Phillips, defensive lineman this year, to the Cowboys to get a better draft pick. Trading Leonard Williams, who was in the final year of his contract and who was pushing 30 and had a lot of mileage, getting the draft haul that he got. Getting Brian Burns not for 2 number ones like I think the Carolina Panthers initially wanted, but for I think, what did he get? A 2 and a 5, if I'm not mistaken. So that was pretty good. So Shane's trades I haven't had really a problem with the trading that he's done and some of those moves he's made. But again, where I do have an issue is I don't think, some of these moves that these guys that have gone away. And look, let me preface this by saying it takes two sides to make a contract. All right. Shane could put all the contracts in the world in front of a guy, but if a guy doesn't want to resign for whatever the reason, he's not going to resign. So, I look at the loss of, for example, Sean Robinson in free agency this past year. That was a blow, in my opinion, because look at how bad the run defense has been, particularly this year. Okay. So that wasn't good. We talk about trades. If guys are not in your future plans, why not look to move them? Now I get it. Joe Schoen didn't want to give away Darius Slayton. He didn't want to give away Azeez Ojulari for nothing. I get that. But isn't something better than nothing, especially when you have holes you have to fill still? You have to address cornerback. You have to address quarterback. Okay. You have to maybe get another offensive tackle, because I don't know if these veterans that they have behind, the projected starters are going to be here next year. You definitely need interior defensive line help, right? So that's 4 premium positions I just mentioned, right? And I haven't even looked at the secondary positions. So wouldn't you want to get as many draft picks as possible, especially if you're signing free agents like crazy and they're offsetting the losses that you have. So I just think, it kind of reminds me of, you know, I just think that Joe Schoen maybe overvalued some of his guys. Ojulari, I had heard he'd wanted a 4th. Um, I think Slayton, they wanted a really good offer. I forget what the offer was, but it was high. Then you go back to last year. If you couldn't get something done with Saquon, why keep him? Why not look to move him? All right. I think they had offers last year, if I remember correctly, but they didn't do anything with it. And why? To save face? I mean, is that really good business acumen? I'm not so sure it is if you're building a football team or trying to build a football team. But that's where things kind of went. So, in that regard, I'm not so sure, if I had to give Shane a plus or a minus there, I'd lean more towards the minus. Even though, again, I didn't necessarily disagree with the decision to let Saquon walk because, like I said, you can't spend the kind of money that he's getting with the Eagles on a running back when you have so many other needs. All right. You can't spend on a safety the 17 million plus Xavier McKinney got from the Packers. All right. The Packers are a little further along in their build than the Giants. So, in that regard, the Giants, I think, they did a pretty good job in getting young prospects who could potentially replace those guys. Now, I'm not saying Tyrone Tracy is the next Saquon Barkley, but Tyrone Tracy's been pretty good for them at running back. Tyler Nubin has been pretty good for them at defensive back, at safety. So sometimes you've got to, take a step back, plug in some rookies to replace some of these guys. And if you can get better value, then why not? All right. There's one other point I want to make. I should have made this in the last segment, and I didn't, but I want to make it now. And this relates to the draft. I mentioned the big mistake being Shane whiffing on offensive and defensive linemen. I'm going to throw in one more, and that is not taking some kind of gamble on a quarterback in this past year's draft. Now, those of you who watch every day or who read me, I was banging the table loudly for a quarterback in this draft. And it just didn't happen. It just didn't happen. So, I understand that a lot of quarterbacks went off the board in the first round, early in the first round. I think 6 went off the board by the time we got to pick number 12 or 13. But you mean to tell me you couldn't take a flyer on a Spencer Rattler or another guy maybe on day 2 or day 3, or day 3 rather? There had to be somebody there you could take a flyer on to develop. And they just didn't. They stayed with, their current quarterback room. And now look at it. All right. Daniel Jones is gone. Drew Lock couldn't beat out Tommy DeVito for the second string quarterback, or the new starting, I should say, to be the starter. Tommy DeVito, based on one performance, granted he was under a lot of duress, but did he exactly provide the spark they were looking for? No. So the quarterback situation, not drafting a quarterback or looking to get a quarterback, particularly a flyer. I'm not saying, they should have forced the guy, forced to pick. I get you don't want to force it, but there had to be somebody they could have taken a flyer on in the later rounds, and they just didn't. So, all right, coming up next, speaking of quarterbacks, we'll talk about cap management and contracts as we review Joe Schoen. And then I will conclude by telling you whether I think he's on the hot seat and whether he should be on the hot seat. So that's coming up right after this. Hey, Giant fans, time is our most precious commodity, so don't waste it scrolling through the same mind-numbing content for hours and hours. How can you spend it wisely to improve yourself? Our sponsor, Hillsdale College, is offering more than 40 free courses, online courses, including literature, mathematics, fine arts, history, economics, and so much more. There's no better way to expand your knowledge and challenge your mind than to open it to learning something new from Hillsdale College's vast catalog of online courses. Enroll today for free at hillsdale.edu/lockedon. There's no cost and it's easy to get started. Again, that's hillsdale.edu/lockedon to register. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, and should Joe Schoen be on the hot seat? I could just hear some of you now saying, yes, he absolutely should, or nah, he deserves some more time, because heck, even Dave Gettleman got 4 years before he was jettisoned out. So, or retired. Okay, so let's take a look at cap management. And I think we've got to start with, the big elephant in the room that everybody, looks at Joe Schoen's track record and says, what was he thinking? And that was the Daniel Jones contract. 4 years, $160 million. People are still complaining about that contract. All right, because now the Giants next year have to eat $22.2 million in dead money. All right, even they are on the hook the rest of the year for $11.1 million, which is the balance of Daniel Jones's guaranteed salary this year. That money already baked in, so it wasn't like they were going to get a cap savings anyway. So let's start there. Now, I have said many times that the 2022 playoff run was probably the worst thing that could have happened to the Giants, because it gave Joe Schoen a false sense of where the roster was. And it totally set the rebuild back. So that being said, Daniel Jones goes out. He has a great year. He's a free agent. And the team, because they were not able to get a deal done with Saquon Barkley, they're basically forced now to sign Daniel Jones, who was willing to play ball before the franchise tag window closed. So originally, and I can tell you this for a fact, folks, originally the plan was franchise Daniel Jones, sign Saquon to the long-term deal, and everybody would have been happy, right? But it just didn't work out that way. So what Joe Schoen did for that contract, if you think about it, he basically gave Daniel Jones guaranteed money that is the equivalent of the two franchise tags from 2023 and 2024, plus a little something extra. Okay, so really, for those of you who said, oh, they should have franchise tagged him, in 2023 and again in 2024. That's kind of what Joe Schoen did with this contract. Now, obviously, you have the dead money, but folks, even though it's a big sum, the cap's going to go up next year, and they're going to be in a position to absorb that dead money. So right now, that's going to be their biggest hit, but it's not so, choking on the cap that they won't be able to do stuff next year. All right. So the contract had to be given out. Now, the cap management, a lot of you always say to me, hey, Pat, how come every year the Giants just don't have enough cap space? Because, folks, you need money to run the team. So if you have injuries, now you've got to sign guys. You have players who are on IR that count towards the cap. The practice squad players count towards the cap. The standard practice elevation, the standard practice squad elevations, that plays havoc with the cap. So all that eats away at the cap. And these teams that you see having, thousands of dollars worth of cap space, or millions, I should say, those are usually the teams that are, they're not very good. And I get it. The Giants are not very good right now. But Schoen is at least trying to be proactive with what he's doing. It's not necessarily working for various reasons, not always his fault for why they're not working, but that's why the cap is what it is. And next year, and I keep saying this, the cap situation is fluid, but next year they're in pretty good shape cap-wise, thanks to the release of Jones, which we all kind of knew was coming eventually. So that all said, should Joe Schoen be on the hot seat? I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being the lowest and 10 being broiling hot, Shane's hot seat is probably, I'd give it about a 2. I do not think he is going to be fired after this year, even if the Giants don't win another game. And the reason why I say that is because while I think it does make sense if you're going to, for example, sweep out the head coach, which I talked about, remains to be seen whether or not they do it. I don't think they will, but we'll see. But here's the thing. I've always banged the table to say, look, if you're going to sweep out the head coach and the quarterback, get the head coach, the quarterback, and the GM, get them all in at the same time and build from there. The Giants had that chance when Tom Coughlin left, and they didn't do it. And they've been doing piecemeal ever since. That unfortunately hasn't worked. So do I think Shane stays? Yes, I do, because I think John Mara, for as impatient as he is to want to see the team do well, to want to see the team win, I think he understands that, look, you've got to give Shane an opportunity to straighten out some of, what he should have straightened out to begin with, which the playoff season kind of masked. So I think he survives. All right. Now, I don't know what Steve Tisch thinks about it. Everybody talks about, what John Mara says and thinks. Steve Tisch is 50% of that ownership. All right. So you've got to take his potential thought process into consideration. But I do think Shane will survive. I have said before that I think he's on concrete, whereas Brian Dable right now maybe isn't on solid concrete. I would say he's on solid ground, but not as solid as Shane. So we shall see how the rest of this year goes. Can the Giants win a couple games? I'm not so sure they can, given the remaining schedule. If they're going to win anything, you would think it would be this week at Dallas, because the Cowboys are just so bad. But you know what? The Panthers beat the Giants, and the Panthers at the time were considered the worst team in the NFL. So what does that say about the Giants, right? Anyhow, folks, that will do it for this edition of the Locked On Giants podcast. As always, thank you for tuning in. We'll have new episode tomorrow. We will have crossover Thursday on Thursday, which is game day. And then, of course, on Friday, I will have my takeaways for you from the Thursday game. I'll actually try and get that online for you Thursday night if I can. So until then, everybody, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you tomorrow.